Dr. Alexander Grigolya was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and he possessed a brilliant mind. After learning English, he went on to earn 3 doctoral degrees and become a successful professor at the University of Pennsylvania. But there was a misery lodged in Dr. Grigolya's heart that he couldn't quite shake. Well, one day this successful professor was getting his shoes shined by a man of lowly means who spoke broken English. But while this man was shining his shoes, he couldn't help but notice how happy he seemed. And so he asked the shoe shiner, "Why are you so happy?" To which the shoe shiner replied in broken English, "Because Jesus came and took away all my badness. It is Jesus who makes me happy." The doctor pulled the newspaper back in front of his face, abruptly ending the conversation, but it was that interaction that he couldn't shake. In fact, that interaction, how this shoe shiner had more joy in his life than this successful professor, that is the interaction that led him to Christ. And Dr. Alexander Grigolya went on to be a successful professor at Wheaton College, the famous Christian college, and taught students like Billy Graham. Why do I share that story with you? Because over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking a lot about wisdom. And my concern is you might think, "Billy, I'm not educated enough to be wise. I'm not smart enough to be wise. I didn't get a good enough score on my ACT to be wise." To which I would tell you, biblical wisdom isn't about that at all. Whether you're a shoe shiner or a successful professor, no matter what you got on your ACT score, biblical wisdom is about approaching God with humility and saying, "God, I am not wise. I need you to teach me wisdom." Here's the take-home message. God alone knows the path to wisdom. God created wisdom. Wisdom is called the master craftsman that was beside God when he created the world. And God gives wisdom to the person who fears him, who comes to him with humility. I want to get started by giving you a biblical definition of wisdom, courtesy of the Hebrew Strong's notes on the Hebrew word chokmah, which is the word for wisdom that Solomon uses. Here's what biblical wisdom is. It is the God-centered ability to discern what is truly right and act accordingly. This includes practical insight, technical skill, administrative competence, relational discernment. The Bible first grounds all true wisdom in the character of God. So it all starts with the creator of wisdom. And then here's a few quotes to bring home this biblical wisdom word more. So J.I. Packer put it this way: wisdom is the practical side of moral goodness. So when you meet a Christian who's not only deeply spiritual, but they know how to handle themselves in a board meeting, they know when to speak and when to listen. They know how to have discernment in relationships. They're great administrators. Those are qualities of a biblically wise Christian. Wisdom could also be said that it is the ability to apply biblical truths to situations. So a wise Christian person doesn't just have a lot of head knowledge about verses of the Bible, but they know how to take that head knowledge and apply it to their lives. And then I think we can all relate to this last quote. A wise person learns by the experience of others. An ordinary person learns by his or her own experience. A fool learns by nobody's experience. I just put that in there because it's funny. All right, we're going to look at 2 big lessons for wisdom today, and here's the first one. The first lesson is the place of wisdom. Solomon, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is going to teach us here that if you want wisdom, there are certain places in life that contain more wisdom than other places. Look at verses 1 through 6 of Ecclesiastes 7. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Now, if you've read Proverbs, you'll notice that Solomon, who also authored Proverbs, These look a lot like his Proverbs, don't they? How they line up in your Bible. And so to understand a proverb, you don't just read the first line of the verse, you need to read the second and sometimes maybe even the third and fourth line because they work together to make a central point. But also what's happening in these verses is in 1 through 12 specifically, Solomon is giving us these better than statements. He's saying this way is better than this way. He's comparing things. And you can tell from these verses that he is trying to point us to the places that are better than other places for finding wisdom. Now, and we'll walk through these verse by verse. I'll tell you this, when I started prepping this sermon, verse 1 threw a real curveball at me. So that's not always great when you're trying to interpret verses. You go, what does verse 1 even mean? Well, I'm going to lean on the New English Translation notes here to give you a couple interpretive options for verse 1. Verse 1 says this, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. So here's a couple options for what that might mean. 1, happy times teach us less than hard times. So we can all relate to that, right? That hard times seem to teach us more wisdom. That's probably the interpretive option I would choose for verse 1. But this second option is also accurate. It is better to come to the end of one's life with a good reputation than to merely be starting life in a favorable manner with joy and wealth. Foolishness and wickedness can foil a good beginning so that a person ends life as a fool. Now let me explain that. The reason that this option is potentially the right one is because the author of Ecclesiastes, that kind of mirrors his story. Solomon had the most promising, favorable, auspicious start to his life that you can have. He was the son of King David. He had money in his family. He was given greater wisdom than any person who ever lived. I mean, you talk about a promising life. Yet by the end of his life, through his sin, he'd become an idolater. And so the Lord redeemed Solomon, but maybe he felt a little bit like interpretive option number 2. If we go to verse 2, this one's more simple. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. The house of mourning is talking about what? Funerals. Than to go to the house of feasting, which is talking about parties. And the reason that there's more wisdom in a funeral than a party is because this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. That means that at a funeral, you are forced to think about death. We live in a culture that always wants to resist thinking about death. We don't like it. We don't like to think about the fact that we will die someday. A funeral forces you to think about those things, and it gives you wisdom. Verse 3 says that sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. That means that seasons of sorrow and adversity, they actually do your heart good. There's something healthy for us about going through trials. Verse 4 is the same point as verse 2, that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, that's funerals, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Mirth means merrymaking. That's talking about drinking bouts, partying, self-indulgence. There's more wisdom in funerals than self-indulgence. Now, verse 5 is a great one. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. The song of fools could also be translated the praise of fools or the flattery of fools. So this mirrors a proverb that says the wounds of a friend are faithful, but an enemy multiplies kisses. That people who love you will wound you. Kids with parents who discipline you, they'll wound you, they'll rebuke you. Why? Because they want you to be wise. They want you to get back on the right track. And so we need to surround ourselves with people who are willing to say hard things to us. That's what verse 5 is saying. And then verse 6, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. Solomon really has a way with words, doesn't he? Well, when somebody would cook a meal in the ancient world, you would get some stuff that could, burn, and the fire would heat the pot. Well, they would find these crackling thorns sometimes in the midst of that, and they would burn out too quick to actually heat the pot. So Solomon's using that as an analogy to say that the laughter of fools, again tied to parties, self-indulgence, that it's morally useless and fleeting in our short lives. Aren't you encouraged today? I went through those pretty quick because I kind of want to return to them now. I want to walk through 3 places where wisdom is found, which they're up there. So we'll walk through them one by one. The first place where wisdom is found is at funerals more than parties. You might be saying, Billy, funerals are not as fun as parties. I know, that's not the point he's trying to make, though. This is not about what's more fun. This is about where wisdom can be found. It's no coincidence this week that I performed a funeral for the late Dennis Smith. Dennis Smith has been attending our church for a long time. He and his wife, Carol, were married 60 plus years, and I have really fond memories of Dennis because Dennis, when he would walk in, I'd ask him, like I ask all of you, how his week went, and he'd never sugarcoat it. He'd tell me exactly how his week went, but he'd never leave it there. We'd end up praying. And so me and Dennis, we prayed a lot. I had the privilege to see him in his final days in the hospital, and I know and firmly believe that Dennis is with the Lord now because he believed in Jesus. Well, when I was at this funeral, it wasn't absent of tears and even laughter. As his grandkids spoke and honored him, there was a lot of tears. There was a lot of funny stories. But there was also wisdom. There was also things being shared that taught us about life and made a lot of young people there think about what their funeral would be like. And as I was at the burial, we were doing the burial with military rites where they fold up the flag and it's quiet. And I was just looking around thinking, wisdom is here right now. There's some wisdom here. So there's something good about mourning. If you've lost a loved one, it's good to sometimes sit there and learn from it. There's more wisdom at funerals than parties. Next, there is more wisdom in sorrow than in laughter. In seasons of adversity, hard things, there is more wisdom in those places than seasons of laughter. You want to know what's never happened to me? I've never had any of you show up on Sunday morning and say, Billy, I went to the bars this weekend and I got so wise. I was tailgating all weekend and I thought, I'm going to go tailgate and I'm going to find wisdom this weekend. Maybe you found it there. I've never seen it there. So here's what people will say to me. Billy, my spouse left me, and it made me realize that I can only depend on the Lord. And I found wisdom there. Billy, I got some bills in the mail that I can't pay, and it made me press into the Lord, my ultimate provider. Billy, I had a health issue, and it got me back to going to church regularly. I have a rebellious child, and it's made me get serious about not just being a spectator in the church, but being involved in the church. In the hardest seasons of my life, here's what I can tell you. When I would go to church, the song would mess with my emotions a little bit more, the sermon would go a little bit deeper, and I would pray a little bit more. Because in adversity, in seasons of adversity, there's wisdom there. There's wisdom to be found. So if you're in a season of suffering and adversity today, press into that. There's things you can learn there that you'll never learn in the seasons of ease. The final place where wisdom is found is in constructive criticism more than constant affirmation. Verse 5 again told us that there is wisdom to be found from the rebuke of the wise. And so I know that it's not fun. It never feels fun when someone constructively criticizes you and they say, hey, you're not doing this right. You need to get back on the right track. I don't know about you. That's never fun to hear for me. But I have definitely learned to surround myself with people who can sharpen me because I know if left to myself, I have blind spots and I'll get off track. You do not want to be a person who only listens to the praise and flattery of foolish people who don't have your good in mind. Maybe they just want something from you. Don't only surround yourself with yes men. You need to surround yourself with people who can say hard things. It's good for us. It leads to wisdom. Those are the places where wisdom is found. We're going to go now to verses 7 through 14. 7 through 14, we're going to talk about the protection of wisdom. What Solomon's point is going to be in these verses is that God has allowed the world to be uncertain. God's not going to show up to you today, probably, and say, hey, here's what's going to happen over the next 50 years. But what he has done is given us protection through wisdom from his word. So look at verse 7. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. So verse 7, it says, surely oppression drives the wise into madness. That could either be translated, oppression drives a wise person crazy, or extortion drives a wise person crazy. What verse 7 is essentially saying is that when wise people, think particularly for Christians here, Christian people even, when they turn to oppression, extortion, or taking bribes, it drives them deep into moral corruption, which can be very hard to get out of. And so Solomon here is warning wise people against taking paths, taking shortcuts to get money, to get other things that will ultimately destroy your soul. He wants to protect us from that. Verse 8 has been a very helpful one for me in difficult situations. So better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit than the proud in spirit. What that is essentially saying is if you find yourself in some type of conflict, or you can't quite understand why a certain event is happening in your life, there will probably come a day down the road. Could be a week, a month, a year, where the situation will make more sense. And what Solomon is saying in verse 8 is people who are wise are willing to patiently hold back their words, not be hasty to make judgments, and wait for things to resolve. Versus being a proud person who's immediately making judgments, immediately saying things. Just think of our Twitter age, right? Everybody's making a judgment in 5 minutes. He's saying that's not wise. The wise are patient in their spirit. Verse 9 builds into that point when he says, do not be quick to become angry because fools get angry. Anger lodges in the heart of fools. So what a foolish person does when a situation is not clear yet is they get angry. Maybe they get angry at something someone has said to them when the person didn't even mean that at all. And so anger can drive us into a lot of harm and a lot of pain that God doesn't want us to have. Verse 10, this is one of those gems from the Proverbs that you just won't find verses like this elsewhere in the Bible. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? It's not from wisdom that you ask this. So my wife had a great college experience. And so when she'll say to me, hey, I loved college. It was great. I'll say, it's not from wisdom that you ask why college was better than what we're going through today. And she loves that. I didn't tell her I was going to say that. I probably should have. Verses 11 through 14 really drive home this point of the protection of wisdom. It says, wisdom is good with an inheritance because the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. So one of the points Solomon makes is that money provides protection for our lives in certain ways. So the word protection means shade. It means money provides a certain level of shade for our lives. And look, if you've been alive long enough, you know this is true. You get an unpaid bill in the mail or an unexpected bill. If you have money, you can just pay it. You don't have to call and fight with somebody to pay it. If your car unexpectedly breaks down and you get a $3,000 bill from the car shop, if you've got money, you can just pay it and move on. If you have a health issue and you have a lot of money, you can go find the best doctor and see him right away. So there is a certain protection to money. Solomon is saying that just as there is a protection to money, wisdom protects a wise person in an uncertain world. That's his point. Verse 12, he says, wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And how do we know he's talking about wisdom protecting us in an uncertain world? Because of verses 13 and 14. He says, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what God has made crooked? So the word crooked there, it's not talking about morally wicked or anything like that. The word means inscrutable. It means impossible to find out. What Solomon is saying in verse 13 is, he, the wisest man to ever live, he tried to straighten out in his mind how God does things in this world, and what he found is that it cannot be straightened out. It's crooked, it's inscrutable. God has allowed certain things to remain mysterious to us. He's not just going to show up and tell us everything that's going to happen. But the way that God helps protect us is he says, you won't know everything that's going to happen, but I've given you my word so you can live wisely. And if you do that, you will be protected no matter what happens. Verse 14, he makes the same point. In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider, God has made both so that man may not find out anything in the future. So, as I was preparing this message, it was Tuesday. I'd spent a lot of the day on the message, and I was already starting to kind of feel like, man, I'm not very wise all the time. And then I went to get something out of my car, and I realized I'd left my windows open, and it had started raining. Which really drove home the point. I'm not very wise all the time. Anybody ever feel that way? You read Proverbs, you read Ecclesiastes, you're like, made that mistake. In all seriousness, though, I have not lived wisely at times in my life, and it has cost me dearly. Maybe you're here today, and you're not thinking about the future and how you're going to live wisely in the future. You're thinking about the past and all the things you didn't get right and how that's cost you. Well, I was thinking about that this week, and I was praying about that, and the Lord reminded me of this story. A story I heard where there was a mom, and she was bringing her young boy to the doctor, and he had to get a big shot. So this young boy was going to get a big shot in his arm. The mom loved her son, so she was quick to tell him, hey, it won't hurt. It won't hurt. To which the doctor said, I can't go along with that. And the doctor looked at the little boy and said, listen, I may hurt you, but I won't harm you. That's what I found in my walk with the Lord. Sometimes I hurt myself by not being wise. Sometimes the Lord hurts me. Anyone being disciplined by the Lord today for something? And it hurts. Like, don't for a moment think being a Christian means you won't go through some pain or the Lord won't allow you to go through some pain. But what I can tell you is the Lord won't harm you. The Lord, when He shows up and He disciplines you because you're not living with wisdom, it is not to harm you. God's not up there saying, how can I curse and punish Billy today? No, He's saying, I want to bless you. So I want to teach you how to be wise so you can move forward in an uncertain world and not be harmed. So here's what I would tell you as we're going to take communion here. We're going to sing a song. Bring those areas from your past that maybe you might feel broken over, that may have cost you. Bring those to the Lord today. Leave them here. Move forward. This is not about condemnation for your past. And then if there are areas in your life today that you're saying, I am not living according to the principles of the Word of God, bring those to the Lord too. Get right with Him so that you won't be harmed in the future. God alone knows the path to wisdom.